Good morning. Happy Friday. And welcome to day 2 of the Home Visiting Summit. It's hard to believe yesterday was such a packed day. It's hard to believe that all happened in one day, but it is. I hope you enjoyed our day of learning and being together and learning from each other. Well, this morning, this is very, very exciting for those of us who are Alicia Lieberman groupies. We are so thrilled to have Dr. Alicia Lieberman, one of the most respected researchers and clinicians in the field of early childhood, and specifically in the field of early childhood mental health. Her session will focus on the importance and the role of home visiting within the complex early childhood space. So Dr. Lieberman really needs no introduction, because for those of us who have grown up in this field, reading her books and listening to her lecture and sitting at her feet, we are just thrilled to have that chance today. But she is the Irving B. Harris Endowed Chair in Infant Mental Health, Vice Chair for Academic Affairs at the UCSF Department of Psychiatry, and Director of Child Trauma Research at San Francisco General Hospital. She currently serves as the Director of the Early Trauma Treatment Network, which is part of a national initiative working to increase access and quality of services for children exposed to trauma. She is, I would say, one of the giants in the field of infant mental health, disorders of attachment, early trauma outcomes research, and mental health service disparities for underserved and minority children and families. And she is currently researching and working on the effectiveness of child trauma psychotherapy and the impact of domestic violence and chronic traumatic stressors on early mental health and child development, and about to publish a new book, one of many. And again, her wisdom and her leadership and her vision has, at least for me, been an inspiration and a foundation for our work at the Ounce, and I know for many of yours. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Alicia Lieberman.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Diana, for inviting me. Thank you all for being here for this really important gathering. Being here is coming home, and no pun intended, of course. And it is like coming home because my first position when I started my postdoctoral work with Selma Freiberg was as a home visiting clinician. Selma Freiberg developed the term psychoanalysis in the kitchen, and this was in the 1970s. She was simultaneously a psychoanalyst and a social worker. She was a social worker first, and then became a psychoanalyst, and she worked for many years with children in the foster care system before becoming a psychoanalyst, and so her integration of social work and profound clinical wisdom with psychodynamic psychoanalytic principles is what was one of the pillars of infant mental health. And she wrote eloquently about the importance of home visiting as a way of seeing families in their context, in the context of their homes and in the context of their communities, being in the neighborhoods where they live and being in the homes where they live. And two examples from families that I visited still stay in my mind as reminders of how important it is to be with families where they are. One of them was an open window in a third-floor apartment with a table right next to the open window and a toddler climbing on the chair, climbing on the table, and then moving towards the open door with a mom who was very depressed, who was very immersed in her own experience. And my dilemma at that moment, as a very young, inexperienced home visitor, of do I interrupt her? And what about the baby? And of course, this is one of those moments that shape you as a professional, because I remembered Selma's dictum, which we've used ever since, of safety first. And so, of course, I jumped to retrieve the baby and then brought that experience into the experience of the mom, of how she is so fatigued, she is so distressed, that sometimes it's hard to mobilize herself to attend to what an active, exploratory toddler is doing. And this is what later we came to call a double scoop in child-parent psychotherapy, an intervention that simultaneously addresses the parent's experience and the infant's experience in as benevolent a frame as we can provide. The other vivid example that I have in my mind was soon after moving to San Francisco to help Selma start the infant parent program. A home visit where the mom was never there, and one day I was walking up to the 7th floor because the elevator was broken, and as I came to the door, I saw a trash can filled to the top with liquor bottles. And then I understood what was happening with this mom and the extent to which her alcohol use was interfering with any other priorities in her life. And I was reminded with both of these cases of what Selma said about if we had not been doing home visits, we had not been able to know about these particular experiences. And so as I come here today, I want to honor the work that home visitors do, that you all do, because it really is being in the trenches in a way that nobody else is. I want to acknowledge that much has changed since those days when I was doing home visiting, from an avant-garde, if you wish, program that was funded essentially by private foundations. Home visiting has become a home of many mansions, a lot of diversity in the models, a lot of regulations, and a lot of expectations from having to scale up to the challenges that we are facing as a society. And yet, there is something wonderfully reassuring to know that relationships remain at the core of what home visiting is, and that my own work has been influencing some of the models in the form, for example, of Child First, which includes a combination of child-parent psychotherapy and concrete assistance with problems of living, which is one of the pillars of what Selma Freiberg created as an infant mental health intervention. And in our own work at the Child Trauma Research Program, doing child-parent psychotherapy, both in the home and in the clinic, the same therapist does all the work. But I have also worked with Stan Greenspan in an earlier model where there was one developmentalist to take care of developmental issues and one clinician to address the mother's issues. And so the model of having two people work with one family, which is also used in Minding the Baby, that my dear friend Arietta Slade has developed, has a lot of value as well. And I think that one of the themes today for me is the importance of appreciating the diversity within the home visiting models and thinking of what works for whom and at what time, and how to make use of each other across the boundaries of different models and interventions. I'd like to suggest that, that as we think of what remains the same, and how we think of home visiting, I'd like to think of home visiting as an intervention mechanism rather than an end in itself. And it's an intervention mechanism that is defined by its setting rather than by a unified intervention approach. And the reason that I'm talking about not an end in itself is because in my own program, we work a lot with immigrant families who live in one room in an apartment where there might be 3 rooms, where other families are in the other rooms, and the question of privacy in the home is a very real issue for them. And so the question of what is the choice that families have about the setting where they receive the intervention, and can we respond to the family circumstances? And there is something always, I think, worthwhile reflecting on, the fact that home visiting emerged as a form of responding to families' needs. We know that we have not, as a country, excelled in providing easy and affordable public transportation for families. And so home visiting was really a kind gesture towards families with a lot of babies, a lot of children, long distances, isolation. It was a way of meeting them where they are. But if we make that initial gesture a demand, we might also not be responding to the needs of a whole lot of families for whom home visiting is not necessary or preferred. And I feel a little self-conscious making that comment here, but I think we are a country that values diversity and that strives to value diversity, and I think bringing that concept of diversity to the question of home visiting as a setting that allows for an intervention, but that can be flexibly changed in the context of changing needs, is, I think, something to consider. At the same time, there is significant variation in home visiting models in theoretical framework, home visiting training, content intensity, and yet the goals remain the same: improved maternal and child health, preventing child abuse and neglect, encouraging positive parenting, promoting child development and school readiness. And what I'd like to suggest is that these goals make home visiting an infant mental health practice. because when we think of mental health, and mental health is one of those concepts that make people a little scared because they think that it's a way of sugarcoating psychopathology. But one of the founders of the mental health movement, Sigmund Freud, when he was asked at a conference, what is mental health? He said, it's the capacity to love well and work well. And if Freud says it, I think it's worthwhile taking it seriously. I like to say, because we are, I think, all students of Winnicott in one way or another, that is the capacity to love well enough and work well enough. Because goodness knows that unconditional love is aspirational, that we all have our glitches in our lovingness, and we all get burned out and tired and fatigued in our capacity to work, and that if we kind of keep going and recover and repair, it can be good enough. And Selma also reminded us that the roots of the human capacity to love and learn are in the first 18 months of life. And neuroscience has caught up with these two wise people, showing that brain development is fastest in the first 3 years of life, and that it sets the foundations for mental health. And it does that by setting lifelong expectations that are kind of stamped in the brain, expectations about safety in relationships, expectations about loving and being loved in a safe way, learning joyfully across the lifetime. And that is why home visiting and infant early childhood mental health are so important. How do we extend this question of mental health as loving well enough and working well enough to infancy? We like to talk about, this is 0 to 3, and I was in the task force, the capacity to grow well and to love well. And that involves affect regulation, trust in relationships, and exploring and learning. And because everything in life is what I like to call a chiaroscuro, a combination of light and shadow. It is the regulation and the repair from this regulation. It is the trust and then the repairing of conflict. It is the learning joyfully and then picking ourselves up after we fail and tolerating frustration. And all of that, of course, within the context of a society's values. I think all cultures share the goals of babies that become productive, valued members of society. The style with which we get there might differ from culture to culture in terms of what emotions are supported and which emotions are supposed to become private, what is the role of autonomy versus the role of belonging. As somebody that comes from Paraguay, where the question of belonging, being obedient, being polite, were stamped in me from my very early years, coming to this country and finding this support for being yourself, regardless of how others might respond, was a discovery. And it took me many years, and I'm still learning that combination of how are you yourself in the context of respecting others. And I think that one of the challenges that we have as clinicians working with very diverse families is how to learn about their values as a guide to interventions that are respectful of the core beliefs that the family has. And as we think of infant mental health in the context of the family, we realize that home visiting targets parental functions that support child mental health in terms of protection from danger, attuned caregiving, emphasis on the dyadic parent-child relationship, and socialization and reality testing. I don't need to go over that with you because you know it very well. And when I write in that slide, each of these functions is vulnerable to stress and trauma. That is a theme that I would like to stress today. Because whether we know it or not, whether we ask about it or not, we can take for granted that the families that we work with have encountered adversity and trauma. And here I think that all we need to do is go back to the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences study, where 85% of a essentially middle class, primarily European American sample of about 18,000 people with health insurance before the Affordable Care Act in the 1990s, 85% or so had at least one traumatic experience, and 15% had 4 or more ACEs. So just as we look at ourselves, I think we can make a quick calculation of how many of us have had traumatic experiences in our lives and have also been blessed with enough protective factors that those traumatic experiences do not need to define us. But it's also, I think, important to know that keeping in mind what happened to people, which is really the user-friendly definition of trauma. What frightening things happen to people that threaten their physical safety, their integrity? Knowing that, being witnesses to that, can really create a sense of trust, of having been seen, that can make the home visiting relationship, the therapeutic relationship, a more productive one. And we can talk about that a little bit more as we go along. So as we think about home visiting, I think that we can say that home visitors encounter a range of risk in the families that we work with, from normative, developmentally appropriate stresses to what Jack Shonkoff likes to call toxic stress, emotionally costly stress, things like parental depression, bickering in the family, the stresses of insufficient resources, things that kind of have a tick, draining experience on one's vitality and sense of possibility. But there is also traumatic stress. And I'd like to convey to you that traumatic stress is a different category of stress, and that blending it with toxic stress often makes us miss the emotional and physical impact of trauma. And what trauma involves is unpredictable, unexpected danger to survival and to physical integrity. It's car accidents, it is family violence, it is child abuse, it is community violence, things that happen unexpectedly and do not give us time to mobilize our coping resources. And when we have a traumatic experience, everything about our conception of the world changes, because our expectations of safety, our expectation that we can go on being, get shattered. And we start doubting what are the signals of safety and what are the signals of danger. And once we have traumatic stress in our lives, normative stresses can become reminders that at any time a stress can become traumatic. That happens to grown-ups. You can imagine the impact on young children who might be constantly experiencing this sense of what will happen to me now, where the mom going to the bathroom after having returned from being in foster care, just her going to the bathroom might be a reminder that at any time I might lose her again. So that what is an everyday experience becomes a reminder of the terror of not having her. So the way that these experiences happen in everyday life are often unrecognizable because we don't have maps that say this is this behavior, this affect dysregulation in response to a loud noise is because a loud noise last time was associated with a parent beating the other parent. We don't have maps, road maps that come with if this, then that. And so traumatic responses are often difficult to understand, difficult to predict, difficult to notice. And so we often go back to a sense of what kind of behavior is that? What kind of inappropriate response is that? And we go to a place of judging and a place of wanting to change things. I think that what infant mental health or a clinical approach to the work that home visiting does is thinking, what could be the meaning of this behavior? What could have been the roots of this behavior? And in that sense, I think that we are all members of a therapeutic community. We don't need to be therapists to be therapeutic. An attitude of wanting to understand how come this family is responding? How come this child is responding this way? What could be the meaning of such prolonged crying bouts? What can be the meaning of the parent being unable to respond to a child that is about to go to an open window? Can, I think, provide new a new sense of compassion and benevolence that gets transmitted to the relationship that we establish with the families that we work with. I'm going to just skip very quickly through the next slides, which just talk about the rates of maltreatment and the fact that the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, really remain very, very common, very prevalent, and are very overrepresented in the families that we work with. And a reminder that if there is one type of violence that is identified, there's almost like an 80% higher likelihood that there will be another type of violence. Types of trauma come together, come in groups. And one of the things that have happened in the last 10 years or so is that we started realizing that if there is child abuse, there's likely to be domestic violence. And if there is domestic violence, there is likely to be, or a higher likelihood of child abuse. And so we need to transcend silos the research for many years was child abuse without looking at anything else. Well, child abuse happens for a reason. Happens in the context of tremendous stressors that the family is encountering. And we have to look at families in their context in order to be able to prevent and repair child abuse, intimate partner violence, and all the other pathogenic factors in a family's lives that interfere with the child's healthy development. As I was preparing for this talk, I read a lot because I realized that I had to catch up with what had happened in the field since I had started. And one of the chapters was a chapter by Paula Zina and John Korfmacher, where it's a 2019 chapter where they talk about the fact that comorbidity is frequent, complex, and in some cases long-standing. And that the types and range of mental health disorders are those commonly associated with parenting, difficulties, and increased risk. And then we need to look at that. And so they are reminding us of how home visiting confronts us with the fact that when there are risks, the likelihood of bad outcomes increases. And at the same time, we have to ask ourselves, how can we, as clinicians and as home visitors, witness, allow ourselves to ask, allow ourselves to listen, allow ourselves to process these difficult experiences without becoming overwhelmed, without becoming ourselves traumatized, because vicarious trauma, burnout are real dangers in the work that we do. And I think that the answer really is both we need support, we need to support each other, we need a community of people that share the experience. We have an open door policy in our program where anybody who comes from a home visit or from a difficult session can come in and talk to anybody about that experience. And we adopted that policy after finding out that the first year that we started the program in 1996, our most experienced clinicians, one of them hurt her back, another one kept having the flu, another one was so fatigued that she kept staggering in at 10 in the morning. And I started thinking, what is happening here? And then one day when washing the dishes, I thought, oh, this is what vicarious trauma is about. Because until then, vicarious trauma had kind of been this concept for me before we started the Child Trauma Research Program. And when I came to the next staff meeting, I said, do you think it's possible that you guys are experiencing vicarious trauma? And the response was, what took you so long? And what I realized is that here I was, 1996, starting a new program and conveying this message of there's a lot of work to be done, we have to survive, we have to prove ourselves, etc. And everybody was trying to fall in line with what my expectations were and protecting me from the cost that those expectations were inflicting on them, but their bodies were speaking. And what that trauma does to people, and that's what vicarious trauma does to people. Our body speaks. It is in our body. And that was a lesson that we keep repeating. We keep having to learn anew every day because it's very easy to forget. And the other component in being able to work with traumatized families without becoming traumatized ourselves is to remember the power of post-traumatic growth. The fact that some of the highest achievements of humanity, religion, art, music, literature, come from an effort to give meaning to the pain. I think cultures that have experienced tremendous violence, tremendous trauma, genocide, have also created extraordinary beauty and have created extraordinary wisdom that they share with the rest of us. And this goes back to the idea of life as a chiaroscuro, and that when we are confronted with the darkness, we have to constantly be looking for what are the sources of light, what are the sources of benevolence, what are the sources of strength. And the realization too that relationships can hurt, but it is the longing for intimacy that gives them the power to hurt. And that longing for intimacy can be harnessed to understand what are the roots for the hurt and how can we convert that energy into an impetus for healing. And so we need to prepare ourselves to embrace complexity in order to become whole. This is something that Sally Provence, a wonderful pediatrician and psychoanalyst at the Yale Child Study Center, said there were T-shirts that said, "Embrace complexity." One of my most beloved students, a postdoctoral fellow with me who's now in Denver, University of Denver, created what she calls BCs to counterbalance ACEs. And BC stand for benevolent childhood experiences. And we administered her BC's scale, which is now translated to several languages and distributed for free, to remember. And interestingly enough, just as there are the average number of ACEs in the families we treat is 8, the average number of BCs is also 8. And so to talk to families about the sources of satisfaction, joy, good memories, serve as a way of helping them not define themselves in the context of their challenges, but also honor the power and the strength that they have and that they bring to their children. And one of the other things that I did in preparing for this talk was become familiar with the framework, the HOPE framework, developed by Bob Sege, which stands for Healthy Outcomes from Positive Experiences, where they talk about how nurturing supportive relationships in the family and in the community and a sense of social engagement really serve as counterpoints to the despair of adversity. And so the home visitors challenge is how to integrate the polarities of trauma and hope. And I'd like to suggest that among the competencies that home visitors need to be given is the tools to ask what happened to you, so that home visiting, the home visit, is framed in a candid understanding of what are the family circumstances. I come from South America. There is a marvelous Spanish philosopher and sociologist called José Ortega y Gasset, who coined the term "yo soy yo y mi circunstancia." I am me and my circumstances, which means that my circumstances shape who I am. And I've had the privilege of witnessing how when circumstances change, families change. I'm very grateful to an anonymous funder who has given us, for example, funding to provide legal services for undocumented families who are in danger of being deported. And when those families get a visa and move from undocumented to documented, and they don't need to keep their address secret because there's no reason for them to trust us before they get to know us. Or when they're no longer afraid of walking on the street or having to make arrangements for who will pick up their children from school if they're taken away by ICE. When all these circumstances change, depression in the parents goes from clinical to non-clinical. PTSD can go from clinical to non-clinical. Their circumstances change. And I often say that legal services are one of the most effective forms of mental health treatment that I know of. And I think the same we can say of safe neighborhoods, decent living standards, livable wages, access to education, access to employment. I think one of the reasons that home visitors can feel burned out is that they are being asked to do the job that has not been done by the other systems that are supposed to have safe neighborhoods for the family, supposed to have safe schools, supposed to have living wages, supposed to have health care. If the home visitor is expected to make up for all those lacks, then the job is not doable because it is not in the definition of what the home visitor is supposed to do. And I think that is also what teachers are telling us, right? That they are supposed to do for children all the things that the rest of society is not doing, the work that they're not fulfilling. And I think I got a little carried away in one direction. I'm trying to figure out how to. But I think maybe what we can talk about is we cannot do really effective home visiting without social justice. Home visiting is a form of social justice. Thank you. And so we have to use our power to say, be our partners, rest of society, and join us in the job of creating social justice, because we can tell you where the gaps are, because we are there with the families and can give you very concrete examples of the things that you need to provide. And so this in turn takes us to the fact that if home visiting is about promoting relationships, we need to care for the home visitor. Affect is contagious. The despair of the families that we work with is something that when we care, we embody. And we absorb their emotions, and yet we might have to leave a home and right away drive and go to another home and absorb yet another whole new package of hopelessness and despair. Only 60% of home visitors, that's also part of my homework, reported feeling supported in addressing difficult issues. So we need to do better for that, because vicarious traumatization is real, and the data show that home visitors who receive effective training and ongoing supervision and consultation provide more effective services. So it's not only humane to support home visitors, social workers, home visitors, we are all in the same page. It's pragmatic. It really helps with outcomes. And so all these reflections lead me to the question of, as we create child-responsive systems, where does home visiting belong? And the answer that I gave myself as I was preparing this talk, that was that home visiting belongs everywhere, but judiciously. And it certainly belongs across the continuum, from promotion to treatment. Selma Freiberg started with treatment. Home visiting now has become also a form of prevention, but because of the circumstances of the families we work with, prevention often really is treatment. It's two-generation treatment. And so as we think of what are the tools that we need, knowing that 100% of the families most likely are going to have 4 or more ACEs. What emerges as an overarching guide is, again, a focus on relationships. And here I want to thank David Willis, who introduced me to the concept of early relational health, which he describes as a paradigm shift to improve child and family mental, emotional, and behavioral health through a focus on relationships across child-serving systems. And in a way, what early relational health does is take the concept of mental health and stretch it so that it encompasses the whole continuum from day-to-day safe interactions, loving attunement, sense of safety, sense of protection, to what happens when that is disrupted? What happens when there is child abuse? What happens where there is the risk of child abuse because of parental traumatic stress, helplessness, depression, mental illness? And how can we move flexibly across the continuum using assessment, using ongoing assessment to tailor our interventions to what the family is needing in the moment? And that in turn leads, I learned, to what is called precision home visiting, which is a very exciting concept, which of course is all-encompassing, and it's also extremely commonsensical, which is give to, what did Jesus say? Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, right? And God what belongs to God. Give families what they need. Give prevention to families that need prevention, but be ready to realize that this family that you thought needed prevention is actually much more troubled than the intake form made you think. And be ready to set aside what it is that the model said that you should do in section 5 in order to be present for the unexpected revelation that a parent that is now trusting you is giving you, because that is what is immediately salient. And the realization that if people keep secrets from us, then that remains a huge obstacle to the effectiveness of what our interventions are. I had that experience providing consultation to a home visitor who was very distressed that an immigrant mom could not be less interested in her efforts to use Reach Out and Read as a way of helping her get excited about early literacy for her child. And she was feeling that this mom was preventing her child from becoming fully acculturated, from belonging. And this was creating a sense of criticism, which the mom, who was very sensitive, really could feel, so that there was a very, the beginnings of an acrimonious, you are not doing what I tell you you should do, therefore you don't care for your child, kind of experience. And then through our conversation, this home visitor decided to ask the mom, let me ask you, you don't seem very interested in this this reading program that I am describing to you. I've noticed that you seem bored, that you look out the window. Am I kind of missing the boat here? And she said, I never learned to read. And the shame of her not reading, her not being able to read in Spanish or in English, and the difficulty of revealing that until there was a candid effort to understand, it opened a new window into the relationship. And the home visitor said, how come? And then a whole story emerged of how this mom had grown up in a rural area. I don't need to go through the whole story with you. And then the therapist, because we need to harness stories of despair to the possibility of action. The home visitor said, would you like to learn to read? Because you know there are many, many grown-ups that never learn to read. Even in cities, there are many. So normalizing it. And the mom said, I don't know if I can. And that in turn led to the message to this mom that she was stupid, etc., etc. And then again, a normalization of that of course that creates self-doubts when you are being told that. And there is a program called the Good Samaritan that is 5 blocks from your house that has reading, because there are so many people in your same circumstances. And that created the port of entry to the mom starting to read with the child. These little books, hardboard books. So the question of what works for whom, flexibly, is really important. And in turn, incorporating an early relational health focus into the training. And here I'm going to just talk very briefly about an example. We created a module, an intervention called Attachment Vitamins, which is a 10-week module, relationship-based intervention. And it started as an intervention that could be plugged into different home visiting programs. And it was part of the Seeds of Innovation initiative that Jack Shonkoff and the Center for the Developing Child has. And interestingly enough, when we used it in the state of Washington for home visiting, some home visitors loved it and just embraced it, and some home visitors said, it interferes with what I'm trying to do, which is what my model is trying to do. And so the whole question of individual differences in home visitors and what works for whom, not only in terms of the families, but also in terms of the home visitor, is something to be considered. We were asked by the home visiting program to shape attachment vitamins into a group visiting intervention. And so now they're using it as a group that can be added to the home visiting program for families and for families where the home visitor feels that it doesn't really fit with how they want to work with the family. Another example I want to give is what happens when clinical concerns emerge. And here, I think the idea of synergies between models is very exciting. In Louisiana, I'm very grateful to Sarah Hinshaw and Julie LaRue, who have been telling me about what they're doing. They're working with the Nurse-Family Partnership and with parents and teachers, and they are introducing mental health consultation to the home visitor so that the home visitor has somebody to go to when clinical concerns emerge. And there is an iterative process where the home visitor tells the mental health consultant about the clinical concerns that emerge. The consultant provides guidance about intervention. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, if the problem persists, the consultant goes to the home with them, and there is a conversation together about the difficulties, and there might be a referral to child-parent psychotherapy as an addendum to home visiting, either in the home or outside of the home. And this kind of flexibility, I think, is something that we can consider, so that I'm just going to skip that. Putting it all together, I think some ideas for next steps might be, again, social justice, cultivating home visitor effectiveness and well-being by giving them the salary, the benefits that they need to do the very difficult work that they are doing, training that is aligned with job expectations, access to supportive consultation and supervision, and using of video feedback as an effective way of saying, what's happening here? What happened right there? What were you thinking when you said that? What do you think was happening when this and this happened? So that it is really targeted to specific moments, because there is nothing like detail to provide effectiveness. General rules usually are difficult to implement. Specific examples can go a long way in bringing a sense of competence in the service provider. And I think that the idea of a national curriculum for home visiting that includes core competencies, which there are. Diana and I were talking about they're doing core competencies training across models, and that involves also trauma and stress as something that we don't need to be afraid of. That is, what are the frightening things that happen to you? and how can we hear them and also remind ourselves of the potential for growth, of the strengths, of the benevolent experiences. And we use a learning collaborative model where face-to-face didactic sessions are interspersed with telehealth that is case-focused as a way of providing training that is promoted by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and very effective. And the idea of constant assessment-based intervention so that new material that emerges during the home visit is incorporated smoothly into the intervention across models. And there is a flexible interaction between fidelity to the model and fidelity to the needs of the family in the here and now. And I think all of that means transcending silos and remembering that we're doing home visits because it might be the best form of serving this family. But home visiting needs to be tailored to family needs, and we need to give home visitors the tools that they need to do that. Thank you very much. This is coming home. Thank you very much. There are questions. I'm told that we have until 9:45, so if my mother used to say, I release you when she so feel free to be released, but if anybody wants to ask questions, make comments, I'd love to talk with you.
There are mics set up, so please. This is Alicia Lieberman. Let's ask some questions.
Comments? Okay. Oh, okay.
Hi. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Hi.
Yeah. You guys first. Let's do rock, paper, scissors. Thank you, Alicia. I work in the tribal home visiting. I'm right here.
I'm sorry. Hi. Hi.
Where there is a lot of trauma. And can you talk a little bit more, like the home visitors that work in my program, they carry this trauma just from living on tribal lands? Yeah. Can you hear me now? Do you want me to go up there and ask you? Yeah, so I work where, I work on tribal lands where there is already a lot of trauma and the home visitors are from the tribe. Can you talk a little bit about how I can really provide support for the home visitors that are carrying this generational trauma?
I think this is one of those examples where we can make general statements and God is in the details. And it is, I think, time to listen. And it's so interesting. There is a saying that the Navajo have for white culture, that the white man is time crazy because we are always trying to do things faster, thinking that faster is more effective. And in the process, we lose the time to listen and to try to understand. That's why we adopted this open door policy, Because to sit with a home visitor and really take the time to hear where their sense of being overwhelmed is and comes from, and ask for specific examples, a moment when they felt incredibly hopeless, and try to deconstruct that moment to see what does that moment offer in terms of possibility of hope in the context of the family. I'll give you an example from my own experience. I was in a home visit, sitting on the floor with a mom and a child. I had been visiting them for about a year, and there was progress, and then huge chaos. Progress, chaos. Progress, chaos. And I realized this mom had a chronic, she had been extremely traumatized as a young child. She had a chronic mental health condition. And I came to expect that this was how she was going to operate for a long time, and that the hope was in making the periods of goodness longer and the periods of chaos more contained and less dangerous and more infrequent. And we were making progress in that direction. And in one particular occasion, I was sitting on the floor with her and her child, and she, out of the blue, said to her 3-year-old, "Go brush your teeth." And he didn't want to go brush his teeth because he was having a great time with us. And she lost it and started cursing him, and he froze and I froze, and then he went to the bathroom and started brushing her teeth. And in that moment, please allow me true confessions, I hated her. I was so angry with her. I was so undone. And I think it was also a bit of humiliation, like, Alicia, after all this time, this still happens? Aren't you a better therapist than that? What will Selma say? And I had to struggle within myself because I had the image of getting up, cursing her the same way that she cursed her child, slamming the door and righteously getting out. And I kept thinking, get a hold of yourself, get a hold of yourself, get a hold of yourself. And I couldn't. And I kept thinking of Selma Freiberg saying, don't just do something, sit there. So I just sat there and sat there and sat there, and I was just, and then she started saying, I'm a horrible person. And I felt like saying, yes, you are, but I didn't. And then an image came to my mind where she had told me a few weeks earlier that she had stayed until midnight sewing her child's Halloween costume to give him the exact costume that he wanted. And something happened inside me, affect regulation. It was like, she's not only this, she's also this. But it was hooked to specific things, right? It wasn't like we all have bad moments, we all have good, it was something specific. And I said to her, there are times when you forget yourself and you go back to a place where you frighten yourself, frighten your child, frighten me, and there is this other part of you that is so loving that you don't remember, and even I don't remember sometimes, and my job is to remember it and bringing it back. And she got up and went to the bathroom. And I could hear her saying, "I'm really sorry I scared you." And I'm giving this example because it really, really taught me a great deal. It taught me how I can become really destructive if I don't get a hold of myself. How important it is to kind of cultivate a sense of self-reflection in order to provide reflection, and how the example that Selma gave me in supervising me to come to this day, how that stayed with me. How it was like all the people, Sally Proven saying, "Don't just do something, sit there." That at that moment, I could embody that, I could say that to myself. If you can create that with your people, that sense of being with them in the moment and create a trust that they can tell you when they are that way, I think little by little it accumulates. It's an accumulation of protective moments that I hope can help. Thank you. Thank you.
I have probably, it's maybe whether they're comments or questions, I don't know. I was really thrilled to hear you talk about the idea of getting away from where we've got to as the home as the site. I'm Lynn Kemp, I'm from the MESH program, and we talk about in our program that home is a construct, not an address. And so home is about the construct of going to where the person is going to feel most comfortable to work with you. Because we work in remote communities, overcrowded communities, tribal communities in Australia, and where overcrowding is huge, and to assume you could conduct a therapeutic environment within those and that the parents would feel comfortable to do that would be completely crazy. So I really commend that comment, which I think probably went through quite quickly, but I think it's actually really important for our work. The other one is, and I won't try to say it in Spanish, the concept of I am me and my circumstances. And I just wanted to get your thoughts back. We kind of have this mantra that we developed from trying to look at families who in similar with incredible adversity. And you wonder why some families seem to be able to more easily deal with and rise above the circumstances that could drive them down, and some families seem to get really suffer from their circumstances. And we tried to we came up with this mantra that what we discovered is the ones that seem to be able to rise above have this ability to do what we call parent effectively despite. So right now, despite the dreadful circumstances, they've got abilities to, whether it's compartmentalise it, emotionally regulate it, they've got the ability to parent effectively despite the circumstances. I very much take your point that we need to be doing, as a broader service system and as a society, stuff about the circumstances. But we've found that the burnout is less in the nurses when their work focuses on the parenting effectively despite, and not so getting bogged down themselves like the families in the difficulty of the circumstances, in kind of the answer to the, how you absorb all that and the frustration of not being able to do things about the circumstances. And that's where we kind of have this parenting effectively despite focus. So I'm just wanting to see what your thoughts were about that in terms of how we do manage as a profession the tension between what we're trying to do in our models, which is the parent effectively despite, and the getting bogged down in the despites and the carrying on into our work and the holding of all the things that the rest of society's not doing. So just any thoughts you might have? Sorry. Microphone.
I think what you are saying is very wise, and I think that in a way, that is what existence is about, isn't it? It really is the circumstances, despite the circumstances. The other thing that I think is really useful to know, there's a whole new set of research, and I'm going to be, again, going a little bit in a detour, that there are people, children. There's a wonderful book by one of my great heroes. He's a pediatrician called Tom Boyce. And he coined the term the orchid and the dandelion. And it's about acknowledging the fact that there are children who from the beginning have a sensitivity to context that makes them more likely to excel in optimal circumstances, but also more vulnerable to the damaging impact of difficult circumstances. So they can really excel and become marvelous individuals with particular achievement when they are given the supports, but they can also really crash. And we often see that in artists, for example, who have parts of their lives that are exhilarating and parts of their lives of tremendous despair, and often in the despair, they get the impetus to go to one of the next exhilarations. And sometimes talking to people about how do they operate so that there is a sense of reflection, and to home visitors as well, so that it becomes a way of getting to know ourselves more in terms of what kind of supports do we need, what kinds of strategies work well, so that there is a constant deepening of the sense of who we are in relation to certain people. And that calls for ongoing dialogue, doesn't it? And it connects to the previous question of how can we create intimacy in the day-to-day work that we do so that we can then create intimacy within the family. So thank you for making that comment. I think it's a very important one. Thank you very much.